Welcome to Distribution Talk with Jason Bader, the show where we dive into the stories, struggles, and solutions from business owners and thought leaders in the wholesale distribution market. Hey friends, Jason here. In this episode, I had the opportunity to chat with Jeremy Wall. He is the co-founder and CEO of GoalMakers. Now, GoalMakers is a online version of an MBA program. I think that's just the simplest way to put it. It's about a 10-week session here, but Jeremy and I ran into each other in Chicago this last summer. We were both presenting our programs to the Association Education Alliance and got to chatting a little bit. And I was intrigued by how they are approaching the online education process. And as we go through this interview, you'll get a chance to really understand, where they came from here and where they took what was originally a 5-day MBA program and turned it into an e-learning program. And, some of the tools that are available to us now have really enhanced the product. And we just had a great conversation about how people learn and really how do we fill in some of the educational gaps that maybe some, managers don't have, or maybe business owners. It's just, it was a great conversation and definitely appreciated their approach to the continuing education objective. I hope you all enjoy the interview. This episode is brought to you by Connected Peers, an online peer collaboration platform for distribution professionals. Let's face it, most managers don't have the opportunity to speak with their industry peers about common challenges in their departments. Sure, they might see each other at an annual conference, but that hardly provides any real relationship building or continuity. What if there was a forum to solve challenges with those in your same role? Well, now there is. The concept is simple. Purchasing managers meeting with purchasing managers, training managers meeting with training managers, marketing managers meeting with marketing managers. You get the idea. There are 10 unique role-based communities to choose from. These are monthly, facilitated meetings, all via Zoom. Ask questions and receive feedback from people who understand the challenges of your position. Isn't it time that you quit going it alone? To learn more and find your peers, visit us at www.connectedpeers.com. Well, hey, Jeremy, welcome to Distribution Talk. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today.
Jason, I appreciate it and glad to be connected here.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure running into you in Chicago at that AEA. Both of us, pitching our wares to the association execs. But, it was great. I really appreciate, meeting you and chatting with you a little bit between our sessions. So I thought it'd be great to get you on the show and talk a little bit about where your journey has been with GoalMakers. So if you wouldn't mind, could you give us the nickel tour of how you got into this? And
Absolutely. And I'll say we're going to be different than some of the other episodes that you record. And I've listened to a handful. And we're definitely a different version of the sort of provider into the spectrum for distributors because we're from the training side.
Sure.
Valuable, but different. And so I'll start pretty far back and I'll abbreviate it quickly. But my background is actually in fashion product development. So I went to NC State College of Textiles, go Wolfpack.
Okay.
And my senior project was in wearable technology.
Interesting.
And so I was integrating electric fibers and lights and sound waves into clothing, all sorts of just tooling around. Almost got hit on my bike. So said, let me put some lights in my clothing.
Yeah.
That went from senior thesis to a company, got some investment in that company. That took me out to the West Coast for about 6 years growing Luminous. We pivoted from smart clothing pretty quickly. No one wanted to really wear lights to a smart bike light. So from a fashion product development background, really into entrepreneurship by opportunity, luck, a few other things sort of coinciding. We ended up making a product called the IO Light. So it was as we like to say, the world's smartest bike light. It's other side, that box right there. That's the product. So made a couple thousand units. And as we were really getting into market right as the pandemic was hitting, it was honestly, if you think about it from a macro level, bikes was one of the largest growing segments and people needed a light for their bike.
Sure.
At the time, my background was really in product development. But the growth, the scale, the execution of, even just from a supply chain side, we're also making smart products. We had software, hardware, the distribution of how do we get that out there into an e-com channel or even into the brick and mortar. I was limited. So
Sure.
at some point, our board came in and replaced me as CEO, which was a tough experience. And I've sort of
Yeah.
talked about it with a handful of folks. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. That's not this pod. But from that perspective, what I realized that the delta in my experience level was I didn't have a business background. I was sort of just
Right.
dropped into the entrepreneur chair out of product development and sort of learned a couple things on the fly.
Sure.
And so in that transition out of that business, was working on a marketing company with a friend and doing some other things here and there. And the friend that I was working on that marketing company with, now my co-founder in GoalMakers, his uncle had a training seminar, and it was called the 5-day MBA.
Okay.
And it was a deep dive into people management and financial management, topics that I had sort of scratched the surface of in my learnings by fire, but
Right.
not in a fundamental training way. It was
Right.
sort of always just adjacent, or I'd read the book or the incubator sort of talked about some of these things. And so that was in 2018. My, at the time, co-founder in a marketing company said, "Hey, I just got back from my uncle's seminar. This thing was awesome. It's what we never learned in school."
Right.
And
For sure.
it was supposed to be a condensed version of a 5-day version of an MBA. So to take off some of the fluff, I know my people listening with an MBA are going to scoff at that comment, but
Oh, I make fun of them all the time, Jeremy. It's okay. It's okay.
and so that was the spark. And it was, okay, how do we turn this into a great business? That was a growing piece. And that's really where, as we talk about the distributor side of it, we'll get into a bit more depth. But instead of being an in-person seminar, we were at a transition point. And this inflection was, how do we bring training into the 21st century?
Right.
And
Right.
so my background was more digital media, digital marketing, content creation, not go to the DoubleTree Inn in Bend, Oregon, sit there for 5 days in a conference room and eat crappy food from the hotel.
Right. And I have done that in many different small cities. I've been there.
All of us have.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of us have. And I think that was the piece of it, that it was, there can still be great versions of that,
Right.
but that wasn't how we were going to grow and scale a company. As two people who didn't have a background in online education
Right.
or the curriculum
Right.
development, that was where you could lean in on that. Ours was, how do we grow a digital-based learning company? And so 2019, that started. We recorded the first half of the 5-day MBA, which was the traditional in-person version. Then we came back in March of 2020 to record the second half. And a week later, the world shut down.
Yeah.
And if we hadn't gotten it on camera on that second half, I really don't know where we'd be as a company, but timing was perfect. We spent about 12 months just building the product.
Yeah.
So what was behind the paywall, the learning, the training, we tried to make it more interactive. We really had a big focus on learner experience and user interface design. And so we built what we feel was a really strong program.
Yeah.
And so that was how I stumbled into it. But happy to go down any channel where we've come from there, if there's something you think is most interesting for the listeners.
Well, I think, again, building that curriculum, I think that's kind of the most fascinating. And again, I have familiarity with, seminar work, because I mean, that's a lot of what I do. And I've done most of my 20-year career on this side, and I do recall, being asked to take these 1.5-day seminars and break them into 5-day webinars.
Yes.
And again, very clunky, terribly clunky, not knowing what we're doing, trying to do this, not being as familiar with the medium. And I think also a lot of it was really trying to figure out what was, in the best interest of that student and participant. How are they going to perceive this type of training, and really, how are they going to get their bang for their buck?
And I think that that's part of it, I almost look at it as a blessing that wasn't my background, that it wasn't curriculum development, that it wasn't e-learning, it wasn't online training,
Right.
because I would have been anchored to, no, this is how we've always done it.
Right.
And instead it was, I don't really know what I'm doing, but if I was on the other end of the computer screen, what would I want to see?
Yeah.
And so it was a big investment in sort of just, how do you make this better? How do you modernize it? How do you add stuff? So I've also become a student of it since then.
Yeah.
So at the time, I didn't know what I was doing, but now listen to a lot of podcasts that are focused on curriculum development and specifically for adult learners.
Right.
Very different than pedagogy is andragogy. And
Yeah.
so from that perspective, the curriculum development was actually part of it, where realistically, that was not what I was brought in to do. It was to lead the company. But what we did was so his name is John Chaffee.
Yeah.
He's a brilliant writer, pointing to the exact same section of my bookcase, but a little bit further over, The Winning Manager's Playbook.
Okay.
We'd written a book, but John had been coaching clients since 1994 as GoalMakers Consulting. And so what he had done was previously was in C-suite at Amoco Oil, C-suite at some other big companies, really a veteran of the industry, had done sort of a lot of in the company work before moving to consulting, where he would work with all sorts of different companies of different sizes, styles. A lot were in the distributor space. And so what he had built in the 5-day MBA that we recorded was sort of two parts: people management and financial management. And we brought in some of the stories from his book that were a little bit more anecdotal from his personal experience. But what we were able to do was take this pretty well built, already out of the box curriculum and repurpose the learning content delivery in a way that did modernize that learner experience. But from a curriculum standpoint, we were blessed to have a really fantastic sort of gym that we barely had to polish to get where we needed it to be. And so that's where, from somebody who didn't have a background, I mean, I was sort of self-aware in what I just shared. My background was missing these skills.
Right, exactly.
It's why I'm so passionate about what I get to do today, is because this was the gap. This was a pretty big gap in my own lived experience and just general education.
Yeah.
And so not having come from undergraduate in business, let alone an MBA or something at a post-secondary degree, to be able to take this really great education and say, now my role in the company is I'm also our lead facilitator. And so how do I help communicate this at a sort of a deeper level of, well, these are sort of generic business principles. How does this apply to you? How does this apply to you, whether you're in gas and welding distribution or the petroleum equipment industry, or we work with all sorts of industries, work with independent insurance agents. We work with the funeral and death care industry. Because these are evergreen skills.
Yes,
people management,
absolutely.
Financial management.
Well, and I think that was, one of those aha moments when I came out of my family business and started into, the coaching and consulting world, is that there are some basic fundamental principles that are applied all over the place. And I think that's beautiful about making, these types of products that you all have done, make them universal. A lot of folks, because I think sometimes people, when they're, creating content, they make it too narrow a focus. And I would also agree that probably a lot of what I do is very narrowly focused on the distribution world. But
it's a big world.
For good or for bad. Yeah.
Yes. And to that point, I think one of the things that's interesting, and we even say it, so we have a financial case study, and we'll get a little bit more into that part of the curriculum in a second, but our case study is of a distributor of rock and tile products, mostly in the concept of sort of countertops or other sort of goes into the built environment. And from that perspective, the first thing I say before people get into that part of the case study, I say is, look, you may have something different in the box. What's on your shelves is different, but the fundamentals of an income statement are an income statement.
That's right.
Your gross margin may be very different than what you're seeing for this company.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I mean, this was invented by the Venetians to help the rich Italians understand accounting just so they could measure their piles of gold. The principles haven't changed that much over the past couple thousand years in terms of income statements or the organization of debits on the left, credits on the right. And so from that perspective, we've been able to just sort of bring this to a level of, especially for those on the distributor side, how do we teach your managers how to be better stewards of the finances, sort of in part A, but then improvers of that financial statement as well? What are the levers that you can pull? What are the knobs that you can turn? Let's start with talking about the accounts receivable. Why does that matter so much to understand your inventory turns? Why are these things that are universal, again, no matter what's in the box? We were with forklift distributors as well, so that's not in a box, but all sorts of things that doesn't matter where you're coming at it from: income statements, balance sheets, and statements of cash flow, universal needs. And then the other side of that sort of educational spectrum for us is people management. And people are messy no matter what business you're in. So
absolutely.
From that perspective, some of the fundamentals of sort of organizational leadership, we don't go too deep into core values or like traditional leadership curriculum. There's other people who do that way better than we do. But everything from goal setting to strategic planning to hiring to coaching to customer discovery, systems and operations, and then looking at sort of your style of management and your systems of management. Those are all, again, things that will be unique to the individual or the department or the company in terms of how they execute on it. But having some building blocks for success, it really is fundamental to even, we have people who are C-suite of large organizations all the way down to sort of the first level leader who just got hired straight out of an apprenticeship. And they're still getting benefits, maybe different levels of benefits at each end of that spectrum.
Well, I think there's a perception that somebody who is in a let's say a higher level job, or it's perceived as a higher level job, that they have this stuff under their belt, and they don't. And they've been faking it for a long time, and nodding, and absolutely they could benefit from this. And if they can drop their ego long enough, they got a good shot at learning something.
And what you just said is spot on. And I know you've had that firsthand experience from your own coaching and consulting. Of
Absolutely.
you sort of say, hey, let's take a look at your cash flow statement. Like, what?
Yeah.
Here's my income statement. It's like, no, there's a different one. Oh, huh. And I think that's one of those things that at the end of the day, it is a surprisingly universal need because it's almost a different language. The language of finance is not something we're taught,
Right.
unless you've had training. It doesn't just come. It's also, I think it was Charlie Munger who said, like, it's not natural for people to understand finance and economics. That's not really like how our brains think.
Sure.
So unless you are trained, you're not just going to fall into it. And certainly there are people who are math brained and that's what they want to focus on.
Right.
But for the average manager in a business who's been in a sales capacity,
Yes.
or the average manager of the warehouse who's been just working on shipping and receiving, starting to understand the difference between gross margin and net margin, especially if it's a 0.1% difference at scale, they have the ability to impact that.
Right.
And no matter where you're at in that org chart, you have an ability to make a 0.01% impact to the bottom line. You may not be able to influence the top line. And I think that's one of the biggest things we talk about. Regardless of your role, you may not be able to be on the biz dev or sales side. You'll cheer them on to keep growing top line. But your impact, your decision will impact the bottom line in some capacity. But if you don't understand the difference between those two lines, you don't understand what sort of any of these terms mean, you may just sort of be lost a little bit. And so what we try and solve for is we work with the trade association to bring this to their members.
Right.
And so that was, as you mentioned, Jason, how we originally met was we're industry agnostic.
Yes.
But what we will work with is a different association. And I think that's what really makes our program unique is we come into the association and say, hey, we're not just going to pull our off-the-shelf curriculum and throw it at everybody. We're going to pair a self-paced learning, so at your own speed, asynchronous curriculum that, again, is fairly evergreen in the people management, financial management.
Yep.
We're not changing that. But every 2 weeks in this program, so typically it's a 10-week long program, every 2 weeks we come together and you're with your association peers. And regardless of the industry, I think actually our first partner in the business was Mahita. I'll use them as an example. Material handling equipment distributors. And so they've got those on the lift trucks, so forklifts or industrial trucks. They've got those in the systems integrators, so the actual software and the integration side. So they're not carrying widgets, but they do still have a lot of the same customers. And then you've got those who are putting in the industrial racking, storage, and
absolutely
3 different segments. But we bring all 3 segments from those 3 businesses to a bi-weekly conversation. And we say, hey, let's talk this out. And let's really go into what makes us unique in material handling. Why is this evergreen knowledge great to understand? And then how do we layer on the industry-specific nuances of our industry? And that's what's really been incredible for us to experience. And I will say it's my favorite part of my personal job is I am exposed to so many different industries and so many different opportunities to really see what's happening from the folks on the front lines.
Well, I think it's so important that, especially, okay, so for example, in Mahita, their gross margins, for example, are very different from perhaps the beauty supply industry. And so that, when you can talk in very specific language and very specific numbers, then it provides credibility and people buy in at that point. They're like, hey, this person's done their research. They know, they're not just a generic program. These guys actually are spending time with us. They get us.
Yes.
And I tell you, it's just, that is such a draw, I think, for people wanting to engage in a program like yours.
And for the listeners who are saying, well, how does Jeremy understand gas and welding and petroleum equipment and the gross margin and the outdoor power equipment? Those are all very different. That's not necessarily my role.
Yes.
I'm a facilitator of these discussions between peers, but what does add a layer of just absolute beauty to the program is we bring in subject matter experts from the industry.
Gotcha.
We bring in veterans of their company who have been part of the industry for decades. They can talk about the trends. They can say, back in my day, the gross margin on service was 10%. Now you guys are out here sweating it being at 50 from 55 last year. Like, you got to understand the larger picture.
Right.
And that layer of context, both from the lived experience that someone brings that I definitely don't, but also from generations of growth and trends and cyclical nature of different businesses, that's what really layers in this idea of like, okay, we can go deep onto subjects in different niches in a way that really does become unique for how that program is not just something you buy on LinkedIn Learning. And
Right.
again, there's great micro learning opportunities there.
Sure.
But if you're going to get depth, it's going to be social focused. And we can talk a little bit more about this, but we have breakout rooms. So as opposed to just being a webinar for 1 hour where you're listening to two people talk,
Yeah.
we sort of set up conversations, say, now go into the breakout room that resonates with what you want to dig into. Do you want to talk about customer discovery? Do you want to talk about how do you collect receivables? Do you want to talk about your customer goal, your employee goal?
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of a choose your own adventure on the live sessions, but then they're in a 15, 20-minute breakout conversation with people who are really living that same experience. And misery loves company.
Absolutely.
So you have some,
Yeah, absolutely.
but also best practices.
Yeah.
Hey, how
Yeah.
are you getting accounts receivable? There was an example on a recent one where there were some shared grievances around one of the larger suppliers that they work with. And a couple people came back from that breakout.
Around the software provider?
Well, it wasn't software. It was a one of the manufacturers that
okay. I got you.
you worked with. And they said, yeah, I'm dealing with the same thing that they're dealing with. I thought I was in a silo here.
Right.
I thought we were the only one who had to deal with this, and we were getting stiff-armed by the big guy. Good to know that the other bigger ones in our industry are also getting that same treatment.
Yeah.
And so there's some level of that really is irreplaceable from just going to watch a video, even if it's the best video you've ever seen on a certain topic, talking it out, hearing some ideas. And that's really where, especially as we get into distributors of different product lines or like-minded companies, can bring a very different flair to the learning than just being spoken at. This is a bi-directional conversation, not one direction.
Yeah, this is something, when you and I met, Marshall and I were doing our thing and talking about, but that's one of the great things is we love to put people in situations where they don't feel alone anymore.
Yes.
And sometimes like, for example, in that finance realm, in accounts receivable, they don't get a chance to talk to their peers in the industry. And so I love being able to facilitate that kind of stuff. Now, I think, and I do learn a lot as a facilitator. If I can just, exit my opinions and then allow, because really as a facilitator, this was drilled into me in a class, a facilitation class, was that I'm the traffic cop. I am not supposed to be the opinion maker. I am the traffic cop. And that's, if I can do that more, the better the conversation goes.
Yes. And what I use, especially with our guest experts, is what I like to say is when I'm sort of prepping them for our calls, I'll say, hey, I'm Al Michaels. I'm sort of the play-by-play.
Sure.
I'm getting us to commercial break on time. I'm making sure that I'm saying the right things as they happen with the slides. I need a John Madden.
Yes.
I need someone to jump in there and say, when I was doing this and be able to go in that depth. But like, my job's play-by-play. Keep us on schedule, keep us on script. And if there's a good idea, let's go deeper there. Let's take 2 steps in that direction. We don't have to stay on the script because there's some real fun conversation here. And I think, Jason, that's what I think you live in your own work as well, is those conversations, if you can facilitate, are going to go so much deeper than if someone's just sitting there sort of saying, what do you want to talk about?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I am so stealing the Al Michaels, John. I am so stealing that, my friend. No, because that makes a lot of sense as a facilitator. But I think that's one of the benefits of being on this side of the fence is I get to learn a lot. I get to learn a ton from like when I facilitate a marketing group. I don't know much about the science of marketing and the intricacies there. I love listening, and learning. And now I'm kind of reasonably dangerous in that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. To go a little bit off the distribution topic, we work with those in the death care space.
Exactly.
So specifically funeral homes, cemeteries, and crematoriums. And just to understand how their business model works, it is something that you pass cemeteries all the time, driving down the road. You've visited loved ones who have been set to rest, but you've never thought about the business model behind that.
Right.
And just to be even a fly on the wall in those conversations, it's so enlightening. And so that's a pretty extreme example, but even as I'm in conversations 4 years in a row with Mahita, seeing how tides are changing, seeing how, you drive down I-85 South, there's a distribution center about every 10 miles that is brand new.
Yeah.
And my wife cannot stand it when I say, oh, you see that DC over there?
Yeah.
Oh, I bet you're getting a ton of new forklifts. Oh, you're going to get some new racking in there. She's like, I don't care. But then we pull up to the gas station and I say, oh, you see that handle? That handle's made by Gilbarco. They're one of the big distributors in the petroleum equipment side. And she's like, my exposure being around all these different organizations from a distributor side.
Yes.
Also, it's just amplified the manufacturer voice in that same space. It reminds you of how much the world relies on that to work functionally without us ever thinking about it. And I think that's one of the things that has been a blessing for me, is just to be able to take a step back and say, I am appreciative of all the companies that I've never heard of,
Right.
that get things where they need to be, that I'll never hear of, that continue to make our world go round.
A friend of mine refers to it as the noble calling of distribution, and I think that's just, he hit it right on, and both of us have a passion, for that kind of thing. I mean, I love appreciating, and seeing that, like, yes, I know it when you talked about the pump handle, I know what you're talking about, and
Yes.
it's
Yes.
crazy. And it's interesting watching, especially in that space where, they're having to pivot and look at electric and look at, where is that next, what's happening to petroleum, where's electric, where's hybrid, maybe even hydrogen. And so it's fascinating once you because that is kind of a macro world, but driven down to a very, a micro industry that you're like, oh, this is interesting. They are talking about some fun stuff. So this episode of Distribution Talk is sponsored by InSQL Distribution Software. InSQL is a fully functional distribution-based software package. I only recommend software packages that were purpose-built to serve distribution. And these folks do it very well at a price point many smaller distributors can afford. Economy doesn't mean compromise. This company is on the cutting edge of distribution-friendly applications like VMI on mobile devices, mobile signature capture, mobile CRM, warehouse management software, and e-commerce development. If you're ready to step up to a fully loaded, scalable distribution package at an affordable price, look no further than InSQL Distribution Software at www.insql.com. That's INXSQL.com.
And as we talk about the finances, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's the most enlightening for me,
Yes.
especially for the associations that have benchmark reports.
Yes.
And to be able to look at a profitability report that represents even just 30% of the industry that has responded to
the
that
report.
data
Yes.
set,
Yeah.
it is so incredible what can be gained out of. And again, I was new to associations 6 years ago. And now that is our only business model, is to partner with leading trade associations to offer our program to their members. But those that can offer these profitability reports and say, hey, what's happening? What are the trends we've seen over the past 3 years? Let's look at a collective industry balance sheet and look at high performers in this sort of top quartile.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at them by geography. Like, that is such an amazing benefit that does only really exist in the primary sector with trade associations, where there is this community level of discussion.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the biggest challenges, especially, is how do you then take that and synthesize that information down to a first level leader who's never been taught how to read
Right.
that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think, and Jeremy, just thinking about the types of folks, who this can be very attractive for. I mean, obviously, we'll talk about managers, new managers, middle managers, but I think, kind of looking at from my personal background, was being a second generation or next generation, person in a family business. There are a lot of gaps in education. I'm going to tell you right now that all of a sudden you're like, oh, nobody told me that one. So
the unknown unknowns are very real for those who sort of, and again, I think you use it as the example of family business. Maybe you've worked in 10 different roles. And so you've got an incredible understanding of the operations side.
Yes.
But is that optimized? Yeah. How does that sort of work against competitors in a benchmarking report?
Right.
And then looking backward at what we try and do is a pretty holistic view of the business.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes from long-term vision down to financial ratios and what you're trying to set for next quarter.
Yeah.
But from that perspective as well, it doesn't matter what role you're sitting in. You can pull some nugget from some chapter. And we also offer lifetime access. So once you've gone through it, we record all of our live sessions. Those are uploaded into the learning. You can continue to tap into this. And I say it at the end of every call. I say, when we went through the section on coach the right people, you may not have been hiring. But next March, when you're going out there to solicit new hires for a specific role, come check back into this chapter. Come watch the recording of that discussion with our guest expert around their favorite interview questions, because that's really a value. Because if you can use this as a lifetime resource, it doesn't matter where you're at in your career. There's going to be gaps. There's going to be blind spots. And we're not the only solution. But certainly from that perspective, Jason, you said in a family business, you may never have had an opportunity to learn how a business should run. It was, how did mom and dad?
That's right. Exactly. How did mom and dad do it? That's exactly what happens. That's the gap, and if they were not, financially minded, if they were the hardcore entrepreneurial startup, I'm going to fly by the seat of my pants and man, we hope this thing works. There's going to be gaps. There's just going to be gaps.
Yes. And you said it earlier, and I'll just repeat it. There's a lot of people who are in the C-suite who are fantastic, and there's going to be gaps for them as well.
Right.
And so I think that's one
Yeah.
of the things we're pretty open about is you may not necessarily need all 10 weeks of our program to complement your skill set.
Mm-hmm.
But you may really love this 2-week sprint where we dig into financial ratios,
Yeah.
or the case study where we just graph out the relationship between cash, position, sales, and then sort of understanding what that looks like in your own balance sheet at the long term and your income statement. You're starting to put pieces together that even for those who have an MBA, they may have learned this out of context and gone through some case study
Right.
10 years ago, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
but now they're in a leadership role and they're able to apply this to what's happening in my business today.
Right.
What am I seeing on my own balance sheet? How can I be enlightened about some of the things I wasn't paying attention to in our AR? And just reset, yep, we need to bring our AR down. We're sitting at 55. My goal within the next 2 years is to get it to 40.
Right. Right.
And that can be a challenging yet reasonable goal that you set as a company to say, hey, if we can do that, that means our inventories, our AR turns are going to go up by one time more every year within the next 2 years. And those are the little pieces of the building blocks that, especially for those who are first level leaders, it's great. And I mean, we get this comment at the end a lot from folks who are a little bit more seasoned, say, dang, I wish I took this 10 years ago.
Sure.
That's the success story that is a relevant piece for us.
Absolutely. Let me change gears on here a little bit here. You said that you kind of were born, literally had this thing recorded and then the world shuts down. So I'm going to make a little assumption here, but with e-learning, again, we had to all learn e-learning very, very quickly in 2020 and 2021. I mean, those of us who had been providing, premise-based, content had to scramble to try to figure this out. So with this, Zoom-based culture, most of us are very adept now at doing things like we're doing right now. Has this been a catalyst for your business?
110%. And I think a big part of it is that because our business model was also to partner with leading trade associations, who a big portion of their revenue comes from the big annual trade show, or the winter conference, or some other component like that. They had to scramble, and some had learning management systems which hosted, but it was usually, here was a lecture that we recorded and then put on the learning management system.
Right.
It's a great repository, but that's not really how we learn. And so that's where that second layer, as you mentioned, for the sort of Zoom piece is, there's great learning management systems where you're still going through a self-paced curriculum,
Right.
but to bring it full circle saying, hey, we can't be together sitting around a conference table right now. But what we can do is have a group discussion and go into breakout rooms where there's 3 people in a Zoom room. It's definitely not the same. I'll be the first person.
It's weird. It's different. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
You'd love to be looking across the table, shake someone's hand, get up and say thanks. But if you can't do that, what you can do is on your lunch break, join this Zoom call.
Yeah.
Have your sandwich in the background. And when we get to the breakout room, wipe your mouth and be part of a conversation.
Right.
And then in 45 minutes, that session's going to end and you can go right back to doing what you were doing. Right. And that's one of the golden pieces of what we've designed, is that it's not something that you sort of, one of the biggest problems with the 5-day MBA was you'd go to this program, you'd be in person for a full week, you'd come back on Monday and you'd check your inbox and say, oh, I got to catch up. And every day that you were playing catch up, what you thought you were going to apply sort of fizzles. So the ability to apply this in real time is a big part of what being able to zoom into the session, being able to do the asynchronous part of the learning whenever you want. I mean, we tell people, hey, if your lifestyle works better to pour a big cup of coffee on a Saturday morning and knock out 2 hours, go for it. If what you like to do is to say, I'm going to take a 20-minute a day type approach and I do it first thing in the morning before I check my inbox, I can get through that same amount of content in a week and a half. And so it's a big piece of the not just learning style, but the delivery method that flexes to people's schedule, that isn't necessarily having to leave the office. It isn't necessarily having to be playing catch up when you get back. But we also, to your point, we're all a little bit more okay with saying, yeah, I can learn from experts and I don't have to travel and they can be on Zoom. And what's awesome is that whole session was recorded, so I can go back and watch the nuggets that I want.
Right.
And so I think that's a big piece of, as you asked the question, like, has the post-COVID world influenced e-learning in our favor? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's also some providers who sort of cobbled together something and maybe didn't make someone's first experience great. So we're always trying to complement that in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, freely admit that my stuff was not that great, when I had to do it. It was on the fly trying to figure this out. And I think definitely it sounds like your platform would be a whole lot better experience than I was trying to provide out there. Yeah. And as we all know, travel, it's become a bit of a challenge, and it's just not as fun as it once was, at least. And maybe that's just my age showing here. But I think, no, that people are more adept or just more willing to find that self-paced learning, and they're finding it. And just let's face it, different generations learn, differently. And this is incredibly appealing. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, is technical hurdles. What was difficult? What's been one of the more difficult things about, providing a service like this?
I think to address what we just talked about, was Zoom is never going to be the same as in person. And so that's a hurdle just from like, how do you get people to accept that?
Yeah.
And so I think once you can get past that, one of the other hurdles I think for us as a company has just been this idea of the standardization of e-learning continues to improve every year. And so part of our vision is to not just sell the same thing off the shelf year over year over year over year. Is it allows us to innovate on the learning side of things, where our partners in the association can always help plug us into the right companies looking to upskill and train their employees.
Yeah.
But we need to continue to innovate, because what worked for us, again, in 2019 when we recorded it, now someone's gone through masterclass and like, that doesn't look like the Hollywood level quality.
The high level recording.
And I think the other technical hurdle for us is it's very expensive to do high level post production, and pretty expensive to do the sort of digital mock-ups that make us really learn well. And so as we look to invest in our business, that's our focus. Is let's not get stagnant. Let's not give the same thing that we had in person but recorded and just put it online. That's not going to cut it. Right. What we need to do is change the way and meet people where they're learning. Yeah. And one of the things we're self-aware on is a 10-week program is a lot.
It is. It is.
It's about 2 hours per week of self-paced learning. And then every other week we come together for a Zoom session. So all in, I mean, you're really looking at somewhere around 40 hours for 10 weeks of learning. I'll say most people aren't spending the full 40, but like if you average it out, what our data shows us is that about 20 to 25 hours to complete this entire program. And so one of the challenges we're realizing is that it, just like you said, the modern attention span doesn't really work for that, for everybody.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is create a little bit more of these micro learning, or, and I may be using that term incorrectly. Micro learning usually refers to something under an hour, like these little 10-minute sprints that you can go apply. What we're looking for is a sprint-based program where you can, in a week, really gain leaps and bounds of not just knowledge, but competency. And I think that's the big difference. Is competency is not the same thing as knowledge. And so how can you actually put this into practice?
Yeah.
We have to redesign our delivery method. And that's a big push. And the goal as a company is to continue to reinvent how we do it, and in what forms and fashions we do it, and what's the visual medium, what's the auditory medium that people are going to resonate with. So it's a moving target, but that's what gets me up in the morning. That's what keeps me excited. I love what I get to do. And so it's sort of a blessing to be in a space where I gave a speech at the American Society of Association Executives. Yes, there's an association for associations.
I am familiar with that. Yeah, and that's a big one too. There's a lot of people involved with that one. I mean, huge.
It's a big one. But my speech was titled, "Can associations take some of," I will say there's a little caveat here, "Can associations take the market share from higher education in modernizing education?" And I fundamentally believe that as you look at the future, there's one college per private or public college per week closing in the US, because a lot of them took on administrative bloat and a lot of them weren't actually serving the needs of the student.
Yeah.
What associations and all sorts of third-party education providers can provide is a better modernized learning experience that doesn't require you to go shell out, let's not even say a 4-year degree, but even a 2-year degree or some sort of certificate from some of these fantastic institutions. You're paying a significant premium just to get that brand on there.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's an opportunity as we sort of continue to evolve, is how do we create market opportunities to make learning more accessible, more engaging, and enlightening? Those are sort of our big three as we talk about them internally.
Got it. So how does somebody get in touch with you all? How do you get involved with GoalMakers? Or how do you push your association to get involved with GoalMakers? I think that's a greater thought.
I appreciate that plug. I will say, if this is something you're interested in, email. I will say our team account is monitored by our whole team. So it's like, that's our collective inbox. Team@goalmakers.com, GoalMakers.com, team@goalmakers.com. And I am happy to chat with you directly. But to your point, we work with a few associations. So go check if your association's already working with us. We would love to have you in one of our upcoming programs.
Sure.
Traditionally, we offer one a year because it's so robust that you may or may not be in it. But next year will be the first time that we're offering a standalone program. So it'll be more open to anybody in the audience. It won't be through only the association. So if you're interested, your association doesn't have the critical mass to run a program, that's where we're here as a resource. So reach out to team@goalmakers.com. We'd love to plug you into one. And then second, if you say, this is something I know others in our association need and want, I would love to be a cheerleader to get that moved through your membership development committees, the boards, and the staff to bring a larger program to whatever industry it is that you're part of that you believe can benefit from some of this upskilling.
Well, and knowing some of the people or the associations you're working with today, I mean, these are really great associations, and I'm sure that they would endorse you, to do that. But Jeremy, it's just been fantastic learning about this, and way more than I expected. When you and I met, back in, I think it was June, if I recall correctly.
It was June, yes.
Yeah, it was June in Chicago. So anyway, hey, thank you for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it. And by the way, I'm just gonna say it on there. Congratulations on your child coming. Your baby coming up here pretty soon. This is a big change for you, my man. So I'm really excited for you all.
I've got do not disturb on, except about 2 weeks ago, I made it so that my wife can pass through at any time, no matter what. I'm at that stage of this game where by the time this airs, I'm probably going to have a child. And by the time I check my phone, I might as well. So I'm sort of on eggshells at any point. But Jason, thank you so much for the time.
You bet.
I'll just say this again. I appreciate what you're doing to continue to help teams and people connect. This is what makes the world a better place, whether it's a one-on-one conversation that gets distributed to others or the facilitated conversations you make happen for all sorts of different companies. It's fantastic. So I appreciate the opportunity to be one of the voices heard.
Perfect. All right. Well, again, hopefully our paths will cross again soon.
Looking forward to it.
All right.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, consider sharing with your friends and colleagues. And don't forget to follow the show on your favorite podcast application. Links to sponsors, products, and services mentioned during this episode can be found in the show description area or at www.distributiontalk.com. Distribution Talk is edited and mixed by the brilliant team at the Creative Impostor Studios. This episode was brought to you by my company, the Distribution Team. We are a consulting services firm dedicated to helping wholesale distribution clients remove barriers to profitability, generate wealth, and achieve personal goals. To learn more about how we can help your company succeed, check us out at www.thedistributionteam.com.